Hey guys, welcome to the Underworld podcast. I am Sean Williams in a wet and windy Wellington, New Zealand, and I'm joined today by Parker Asmann, a Mexico-based investigative reporter with the always excellent Inside Crime. And he's been looking into just about every major organized crime story that I'm sure you will all be interested in. And it is Mexico that we're going to speak about today. So thanks for joining us, Parker. How is it going out there? And it's a busy time to be a Mexico-based reporter, I would imagine.
That's exactly right, Sean. Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. As you mentioned, it is never a dull moment in the organized crime world in Mexico. So we have been quite busy in recent months, especially with the arrival of two new presidents, both in Mexico and in the United States. So there has been no shortage of coverage on our end.
Yeah. So I guess we'll start at the top, which for us would be, I guess, like especially for American listeners, there's been a lot of talk. It's hard to parse what is true and what is BS coming out of the White House at the moment, but designating cartels terrorist organizations is something that the Trump White House has been speaking about a lot. How has it gone down over there? How likely is it? I mean, it's just hard to really sort of pull apart fact from fiction when it comes to a lot of this signaling.
It really is. I mean, I think to some degree, this is something that certain sectors of the U.S. political establishment have discussed and debated for many years. And President Trump most recently was the first to actually follow through on those words and designate certain Mexican organized crime groups as foreign terrorist organizations alongside other street gangs and some other transnational gangs in El Salvador and in Venezuela. For us at Inside Crime, I mean, the move seems a little misguided because it's based on this idea that we're speaking about monolithic groups that have this very clear leadership structure that's from the top down to the bottom. And in reality, what we've seen as we investigate organized crime throughout the years is that these are actually highly complex, horizontally integrated organizations with no clear lines separating who is actually a member of the network and who is not a member of the network. And I think one of the things that is unclear from the position of the White House is where do you draw the line about who is a member of an organized crime group and who is not? And experts have told us that that's one of their main concerns, that, everyday people will get caught up in this designation as in some way or another aiding and abetting foreign terrorist organizations, even if that's inadvertently, say you're, a businessman who's being extorted or a migrant who is forced to pay a criminal group to survive in Mexico. So again, it was something that has been debated for many years, but it's finally, come into play here in Mexico. And I think we're still very much trying to see what exactly it means on the ground and how exactly things will play out.
What has been the reaction from the new Mexican government, Claudia Scheinbaum's office, to this? Because it would seem to give the US extraordinary powers to go in with force against groups where there has been, I guess, a sort of standoffish political relationship in the last few years about the cartels.
Right. I think President Scheinbaum has been very strategic and very savvy in the way in which she interacts and negotiates with the Trump administration. I think one thing she has constantly fallen back on is this idea of Mexican sovereignty, that Mexico is its own country. They are not going to allow for a foreign government to come in unannounced and carry out these, very high level, dangerous security missions against organized crime groups that are operating in their country. At the same time, we've seen that she has been very willing to share information and collaborate with the Trump administration. And I think that that is a strategic decision to sort of, hold off their hopes or plans of potentially, using some greater force in Mexico to go after the criminal groups that operate in Mexico.
Is it a sort of similar messaging that you might see with the Canadians in that, they'll set up a fentanyl czar to try and sort of keep the White House, just, keep everything quiet for a little while until maybe some political fallout sort of spills. I don't know, sort of the ashes settle. So what?
Absolutely. I mean, I think if you look at the timeline of when the foreign terrorist designation was made and some of the security actions that were taken in Mexico in the days and weeks following that, you saw very high profile arrests. You saw large seizures of synthetic drug labs, increased efforts to combat fentanyl, the deadly synthetic opioid that is driving, a surge in U.S. drug overdose deaths in the United States. So I think, there were some very concerted actions that the Mexican administration decided to take in the wake of this designation to show that they are committed to combating these groups, and they would like the Trump administration to understand that.
Yeah. And so this, I mean, people would have surely read the news about this, the sort of extradition of 29 high-profile cartel figures. That is pretty massive news, and I imagine it's caused a lot of shockwaves in and out of Mexico. Was that a surprise? Was that something that was on the cards for a while, or was it just completely out of the blue?
Speaking for me personally, I would call it a total shock, unprecedented, historic. We'd never seen anything like that. And I want to be clear is that it wasn't necessarily an extradition. They've been very careful about the language that they use to describe what happened. And they're saying that it was a mass transfer, that the U.S. secured custody of these leaders. Because when you go through a formal extradition process, the U.S. has to request the extradition. A Mexican court has to rule on that request. And there's a process by which the order needs to go through before that extradition can be approved. From what we know so far, it seems like that did not happen, and that the administration in Mexico decided to voluntarily transfer some of these people that they knew were high-value targets in the U.S. into the custody of the U.S. government. And by doing so, they were able to sort of bypass, seemingly, the legal requirements that one would have to go through if this was a standard formal extradition proceeding. But as you mentioned, we had never seen anything like this before. I mean, certainly it's not uncommon for the Mexican government to extradite criminal leaders to face charges in the United States. But the scale of this mass transfer was unlike anything we had ever seen before.
And so who are these guys, if that's not too simplistic to say, and how important figures are they within the cartels?
I think it depends on the perspective that you're looking at these mass transfers through. So the list in general, you had 29, some high-level narcos, other mid-level commanders, from a who's who of different Mexican organized crime groups. Certainly the most headline-grabbing names were Caro Quintero, the former Guadalajara cartel leader who was accused of torturing and murdering a DEA agent in 1985, who the U.S. has been after for decades and has had this very interesting career path in and out of the Mexican judicial system, and had been freed from Mexican jail. Another pair of brothers who were very high on that list were the Trevino Morales brothers, the former leaders of the Zetas, which was this sort of paramilitary wing that used to operate as the armed enforcers of the Gulf Cartel before they broke away and formed their own group. You also had some recent individuals who were recently captured and affiliated with the Chapitos, a faction of the Sinaloa cartel. You had other leaders of different factions of the Gulf cartel. So you really had a wide range of narcos who were sent to the United States. The impact on the ground, I would say, is harder to measure. When you look at the list of individuals who were sent, the majority of them have been out of Mexico's criminal landscape for many years. So the idea that they would still have relevant information to share with U.S. authorities or, had any sort of sway or influence over the current operations on the ground within some of these organized crime groups is less certain. Certainly, the Trevino Morales brothers, for example, have been accused of continuing to run an offshoot of the Zetas known as the Northeast Cartel from behind bars. U.S. prosecutors had unsealed a new indictment against them shortly before they were transferred into U.S. custody. But aside from that, a lot of these individuals have been, quote unquote, out of the game for many years.
So it's more a symbolic act than a kind of cartel busting move then, would you say?
I think that's a fair way to characterize the mass transfer. For us, it was largely symbolic. I mean, the fact that the U.S. had been pleading and trying and working very hard to extradite a number of these figures, such as Caro Quintero and the Trevino Morales brothers, and President Scheinbaum was willing to include them as part of this mass transfer. What was huge for them, I mean, for anti-drug agents in the United States, I mean, this was a massive win. They've been trying since 1985 to hold the individual they accuse of being responsible for killing a DEA agent accountable. And they finally have him in a U.S. prison. So I think while it was very much symbolic and there are questions about the actual impact on the ground as it relates to the organized crime groups, for U.S. authorities, this is absolutely a win for them and is sort of a notch on their belt to have these very high-profile leaders that they had so far been unsuccessful at transferring into their custody.
And so with the, I guess, just to speak of the Chapitos in the war going on in Michoacan, other cartel feuds and violence sparking off across the country, then has there not been much of a fallout or a rise or decrease in violence that you've seen on the ground as a result of this?
It's hard to gauge which part of the violence may or may not be directly related to this mass transfer, but generally speaking, we haven't really seen anything that would suggest that violence has erupted as a specific result of these mass transfers. One place that people were very focused on was Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, which had sort of been the historic operational center, if you will, for the Zetas. And many of the top-level leaders that now control the Northeast Cartel, the main offshoot of the Zetas, are still in some way linked to the Trevino Morales family. So there was some uncertainty about whether or not violence there would erupt as a result of these mass transfers, specifically of the two brothers. And a local sheriff's office operating in the city of Laredo had also sent out an alert to the community saying that these mass transfers are currently taking place and that we are on alert if anything, should happen to break out. We didn't see anything. So I don't think any of the evidence that we've seen suggests that there had been any sort of significant fallout on the ground in terms of violence that's related to these mass transfers.
Okay. And in the flow of fentanyl as well, I mean, that would appear to be a sort of top-level goal of both governments to try and smash these sort of labs creating fentanyl to go across the border. Has anything changed in the flow of that drug recently?
I mean, in some ways, yes. So there are a variety of different indicators that you can look at to try and, ascertain drug flows. And one of them, obviously, is seizures on the border. And if you look at the data from U.S. Customs and Border Protection, the agents that, supervise and patrol the U.S.-Mexico border, seizures that those agents have made of fentanyl have dropped significantly in recent months. So there is speculation by some that the production of fentanyl has slowed down and decreased in the context of this uptick, I would say, in cracking down on these organized crime groups, both from the U.S. side with these terrorist designations and other actions, and from the Mexican side with the different seizures. At the same time, seizures are only one indicator. So you need to look at a variety of different factors to determine, where exactly drug flows stand and whether availability of those drugs, especially in the United States, which is the primary consumer of that synthetic drug, has changed at all. So I think there are certain indicators that suggest flows of fentanyl are changing, but I think we're all sort of still trying to figure out how exactly they're changing, in what ways, and what it means for organized crime dynamics in Mexico.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, I guess it's hard to keep abreast of the flow of these drugs because it's just it's always in flux, right? And it's always changing from group to group. Yeah.
It is. And I mean, with fentanyl, you're talking about a drug that can be produced in such small quantities and smuggled in such small quantities. So, it's not uncommon to see authorities seize millions of pills in a single effort. But at the same time, it's not unheard of for organized crime groups to routinely produce millions of pills. So yeah, it's something we're continuously monitoring to try and get a better handle on what exactly is happening.
And I guess the other huge headline from the last couple of weeks was the discovery in Jalisco of this so-called, it's many names, but I think terror or horror ranch, this sort of death camp in actually the people who were looking for disappeared relatives and loved ones had been looking into for some time. So there's a question over the cops there, but what is the kind of latest on that? Has there been a huge public outcry in the wake of this discovery?
Certainly across Mexico, it has created widespread alarm and anguish among especially those collectives that are looking for their missing loved ones. And as you mentioned, this specific ranch in Jalisco had been intervened in some way by authorities months ago. So it wasn't something that had just, randomly popped up and came onto the radar of local authorities. And I think that is something that has frustrated these collectives who are searching for their missing loved ones, is this sort of lack of support that they feel from the state in supporting their efforts to find their missing loved ones. And I think there are still a lot of unanswered questions about exactly what we're dealing with, whether this was a crematorium where they had murdered scores of people, whether this was a training camp where people were forcibly recruited and forced to enter into, to then be trained up to go fight for the Jalisco cartel in different parts of Mexico. I think there are a lot of unanswered questions, and the authorities have done a questionable job about securing the site itself, the evidence involved. There was a scene just this past week where a number of loved ones, members of these collectives looking for their family members, were granted access to this site. And there were a lot of questions about, the chain of command as it related to the evidence, what had happened to the site between the time it was discovered and taken over by the authorities and the time where all of these individuals were allowed to essentially explore what had been found and uncovered at this site. But it's caused nationwide outcry. Shortly after the discovery, there were protests held all throughout Mexico and almost every major city sort of denouncing this crisis of forced disappearances, which at times many have told us doesn't necessarily get the amount of attention that maybe the violence does or the number of homicides. But there's still, this crisis, for lack of a better word. I mean, it absolutely is a crisis, and there are scores of families who have been affected by these forced disappearances.
Is there more? Is it different to when? I mean, there was a huge public and international outcry in 2014 after the 43 students were massacred in Ayotzinapa. It seems like there's been a similar reaction in this case, in, I guess, the sense of state collusion in these deaths, and at least the sniff of some kind of work between police and organized criminal elements. I mean, what have politicians said about this? What have the police said about this? Has there been any kind of, definitive statements that would suggest that anything is really going to be done about this?
I think that's one of the main criticisms of these collectives that are searching for their missing loved ones, is that there hasn't been any clear narrative or clear response from the government up until now to explain what happened. How is it that this ranch was seized months prior and there's the potential that it continued to operate and that people continued to either be recruited there or victimized there or what have you? There is this, frustration, I think, that was also felt in the Ayotzinapa case, of this state neglect, of maybe just omission, of not being forthcoming about what had happened, what potentially happened at this site, and just a lack of answers for missing loved ones and the families of those missing loved ones who are very expectantly distraught by the discovery of something like this, because I think it also, to some degree, brings them a glimmer of hope that maybe their missing loved one is in this camp and that they might have some closure to this, horrific experience that they've been enduring day after day. But they can't count on getting any clear answers from the authorities that are, supposed to be working on their behalf.
In the time that you've been working out of Mexico, have you sensed any shift, I guess, in the way that, in the kind of general atmosphere around reporting sort of sensitive organized criminal cases? Has there been, I don't know, a kind of reaction to the last, even by the cartel standards, the last year or so has been pretty crazy in terms of the amount of violence and captures and discoveries in the news. Has that changed the way that you're reporting stories? Has that changed the way that contacts are reaching out to you, or otherwise? Is it just become a more difficult place to do work there?
I think Mexico has always been a very complicated place to report, primarily for the violence that has long been associated with the quote-unquote drug war that kicked off officially, if you will, in 2006. But at the same time, the criminal landscape has evolved in a way that has become much more complex, much more fragmented. So I think that in a lot of ways complicates the ways in which we have to approach our reporting. And we always abide by a very strict security protocol and ensure that we do certain things that will mitigate the risks that are inevitable that come with reporting on organized crime in Mexico. One thing I will say is, as an American, as a U.S. citizen, the risks that I face are nowhere near the risks that local reporters working for Mexican outlets face, that are forced to work 2 and 3 other jobs in addition to their reporting job in order to put food on the table, to support their families, etc. And those people often live in the communities that they're reporting on. They grew up in the communities that they're reporting on. So I think the risks for them are exponentially higher than the risks that we face. Not to say that there aren't still risks and certain dangers that come with the reporting. But we always try and keep in mind that the situation for local reporters is much different, and we try and do the best that we can and abide by these strict protocols to not only keep ourselves safe, but also the local reporters that we often work with.
Now, you don't just report on Mexico per se, you report across Latin America, the Caribbean as well. Where else have you been kind of looking into recently that you think is sort of posing interesting questions in the organized crime world?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in the organized crime world in Latin America. We just recently, at the start of this year, we published an annual homicide roundup, which we do every year, and we look at dozens of countries across Latin America and the Caribbean, and identify trends and developments in violence and homicides. And one of the things that really piqued our interest this year is just the increase in homicides in the Caribbean, which we hadn't seen to this degree in years past. So that's one development that we're sort of monitoring on our end to try and get a better understanding of what exactly is happening, how these gangs are operating, how exactly they're acquiring weapons. In some cases, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that many of the weapons are coming from the United States and being trafficked into that region. So I think that's one of the more concerning developments that we've identified recently that we're going to continue to keep looking into. And then broadly speaking, I think we're much more interested now in the environmental consequences of organized crime and the different ways in which criminal groups are plundering the environment and hurting natural resources as they pursue a variety of different criminal economies. We've been looking at the intersection between corruption and environmental crimes and how corrupt political elites may foster the illegal activities of crime groups that at the same time destroys the environment, which I think is a very pressing issue now, given, everything that's going on with the environment, the climate crisis, just the stakes, seem to be higher than ever every day.
Yeah, give me an example of that then. What kind of damage, what kind of sort of crimes have you been looking into on that front?
I mean, I think there are a number of different criminal economies that deal with the environment. Certainly, I think one of the most damaging is the illegal gold trade. You've got criminal networks that are mining gold illegally and destroying the environment, and that gold is laundered into the illicit supply chain that, touches multi-billion-dollar corporations that all of us interact with on a daily basis. There's other criminal economies like illegal logging, the buying and selling of wildlife. And then on a more sort of granular scale, we've uncovered cases where there may be collusion between local political actors and local business elites to push through infrastructure projects that may be popular politically and among their constituents, but are actually, done illegally and don't follow all the necessary regulations and protocols that you would need to follow at the expense of the environment. And you see, levels of deforestation increasing, access to water becoming a problem in certain parts of the region. So there are a number of different criminal economies that I think touch on the environment, which again makes it so concerning.
And you recently published a piece about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, about Honduras as well, right? And Central America. I mean, each country is very different in the makeup of its criminal elements. But what's actually going on there, and how intertwined do state actors appear to be with organized criminal groups?
Yeah, so Honduras is another complicated case. I think in recent years, the nexus between the political establishment and organized crime has really come into focus. Most famously, a former president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, was arrested and extradited to the United States, put on trial for cocaine trafficking, and eventually convicted and sentenced to prison time. That was just the latest in a number of judicial cases that were tried in the United States that exposed these linkages between local mayors, members of Congress, presidents, vice presidents, and different organized criminal actors that operate in the country. More recently, I think the biggest story in Honduras at the moment is whether or not the cultivation of coca, the raw ingredient that you produce to produce cocaine, is taken off in a way that would allow criminal groups in Honduras to not only cultivate coca, but also process that coca into cocaine, and what that could potentially mean for transnational criminal dynamics in Central America, the relationships between those criminal groups and their counterparts in traditionally cocaine-producing countries like Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and what could be happening there, and the connections between those groups and their Mexican counterparts as well, which is a story that we've been following very closely and trying to get a better understanding of what exactly is happening.
Yeah, I genuinely had no idea that coca was coming out of Honduras. Is Is that a growing thing across Central America? Because I would imagine the environmental conditions are similar in most of those countries.
Yeah, so I think Honduras so far has the strongest evidence that this has progressed from just being an experiment to now something that is actually taking place. Coca is being cultivated, in Honduras. That I think is a fact. What we're still trying to figure out is how exactly those coca leaves are being processed and transferred into cocaine. Authorities have come out and announced that they have seized some rudimentary processing labs that they claim are being used to process those coca leaves into cocaine. The scale at which that is happening is still very much unclear. We don't know if this is actually true, if it's an isolated incident, or how exactly that is occurring at the moment. But there were a number of academics recently that did a study essentially on the environmental conditions in Central America being very ripe for the cultivation of coca. And we've seen Honduras sort of, I think, come into focus as the clearest example of a Central American country that does have, these perfect climate conditions for the cultivation of coca. And it has grown in a way in recent years that I think has caught the attention of a lot of people, especially organized crime observers.
Well, that's so fascinating. I mean, I'd love to come back to you further down the line on that stuff, because I think, we had done an episode recently on sort of shifting tides in the production of coca across Latin America, but I really didn't have a clue that it was going on in Central America as well. It's great. Parker, thanks ever so much for speaking to me. Where are you recording from, by the way? That background it seems like you're recording from a sort of like cave somewhere.
It's not a bad guess. I'm actually based in Mérida, in the state of Yucatan, in the east of Mexico. And it is famously known for being the site where the meteor that knocked out all the dinosaurs hit and created this sort of underground system of cenotes, these natural water wells that are very cavernous. And a lot of the homes here have this kind of rock wall feature. So you're right on the money.
That's fantastic. Well, thanks again, Parker. And we'll have to come back to you at some point soon to talk about some of the coca production stuff, because that's really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sean, for having me. It's a pleasure to interact with you all at the Underworld podcast. It's one that we listen to frequently. So thank you so much for taking the time and inviting me on.
Cheers. Thank you.